All right, let's dive right into this. We're looking at the analysis of Charlie Kirk's assassination and the really complex, often contradictory narratives that just exploded afterwards.
Yeah, the piece does a solid job laying out the facts, the crime, the memorial, the whole free speech debate that followed. It's all there.
It is. So we're moving straight to the critique, focusing on how these very controversial elements are actually presented and interpreted.
Fundamentally, the structure's sound, but I think to really elevate it, we need to push beyond just documenting what happened and get into some bolder interpretation.
Okay, first big area then. The analysis seems to struggle a bit with reconciling the two sides of Kirk that emerged post-death, the martyr versus the provocateur.
Exactly. It documents the competing stories really well. On one side, you've got Trump calling him a great American hero, a martyr.
Right, and the huge spike in TPUSA signups, what was it, 62,000 students? Massive interest.
But then it also notes correctly his history of really inflammatory stuff, calling George Floyd a scumbag, the hard line on abortion with no exceptions for rape.
So the weakness isn't the facts. It's presenting them as just two separate things. Like on the one hand this, on the other hand that.
Yeah, it stops short. It doesn't explain how that very conflict, that dual image, actually functioned politically, how it helped the movement.
Okay, so the suggestion?
We need to strengthen the interpretation around the political utility of the martyrdom narrative. Shift the question.
Less, was he a hero or a provocateur?
Right. That's descriptive. We need something more analytical, like, how did the movement immediately leverage his death to normalize his more extreme views and, frankly, accelerate their growth?
Framing the assassination less as just a tragedy and more as a political catalyst.
Precisely. And the evidence is already in the material. Those 62,000 signups, the millions pouring in. Don't just list them as outcomes.
Analyze them as direct proof the strategy worked, that the rebranding or maybe the hardening was successful.
Exactly. Connect the dots. Show that spike because of the way his death was framed.
And for the ideological part, how do we show that normalization in action?
Use the quotes. Pair someone like Stephen Miller saying critics have no idea the fire you have ignited, that dragon you have awakened.
That real, vengeful, almost apocalyptic language.
Yes, pair that directly with Kirk's actual, documented, more extreme ideological positions, like his endorsement of the Seven Mountains Mandate.
Which, for listeners who might not know, is that idea about Christians needing to take control of 7 key areas of society, government, media, education.
Right.
It's a pretty theocratic concept.
So you show Miller's post-death fire breathing next to Kirk's own push for that kind of agenda.
And the argument becomes?
The argument becomes that the martyrdom narrative provided the political cover, the sort of emotional shield needed to push that specific maximalist ideology further into the mainstream faster. It wasn't just remembering him. It was weaponizing his memory.
Okay, that sharpens the focus significantly. Let's move to the memorial service itself. That produced some incredibly stark contradictions.
Oh, absolutely. The whole discussion around forgiveness is powerful, but I think the analysis needs to frame that dissonance between Erica Kirk's words and Trump's much more sharply.
Frame it not just as a personal, spiritual statement versus a political one.
Exactly. Frame it as a critical ideological fissure right within the movement.
Okay, so the weakness identified is that the piece captures the contrast, Erica Kirk saying, "Thy will be done, I forgive him," which is profound.
Incredibly profound Christian sentiment right there.
And then Trump, almost immediately after, from the same stage, saying, "I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them." The analysis notes this, but doesn't dig in to why that happened. Why was the forgiveness theme essentially rejected on the spot?
Yet it's treated as a deviation rather than a core conflict. So the suggestion is to really elevate that contrast, make it a central argument about, frankly, the limits of public forgiveness when it gets tangled up with raw political power.
So the analysis should ask, can that kind of public forgiveness even work? Can it be sincere if your most powerful political allies basically nullify it moments later?
Right. Especially when they nullify it by calling for the opposite, hatred, retribution, using the tragedy itself to fuel more antagonism.
It was almost like a choice point in real time. Christian forgiveness versus political vengeance.
And the choice was pretty clear, wasn't it? made right there on stage.
So, to make that argument stronger in the analysis,
Highlight the setting. The memorial itself became the site of this clash. Trump wasn't just disagreeing later, he was challenging that core principle in that moment, right after Erica spoke. It shows the immediate priority.
vengeance over mercy, in political terms.
And then you can maybe tie it into the material side too. Reference the debates that were happening around the family's assets that reported $5.6 million estate and the huge fundraising drive.
So connecting the ideological choice to the, let's say, financial and political machinery.
Exactly. Ask that tough question some critics were asking. Does this whole performance risk looking like, profaning the holy for personal advancement if you ditch the spiritual message that quickly for political gain?
It raises questions about the whole enterprise, including the fundraising built around that moment.
It deepens the analysis of that tension between the sacred and the cynical political calculation. Shows how everything becomes potentially weaponized.
Okay, I see that. It makes the contradiction much more potent.
And that leads us pretty naturally to the third point, doesn't it? If spiritual ideals are potentially sidelined for political utility, what about constitutional ideals, like free speech?
Right. The material documents this big crackdown on Kirk's critics right after the assassination. But the critique needs to frame this as more than just hypocrisy. It's a real constitutional paradox.
A high-stakes one. You have the very movement that claims to be the champion of free speech deploying almost instantly what look like classic cancel culture tactics.
And the weakness here is that the analysis lists these actions: Kimmel's show suspended after FCC threats, hundreds of teachers investigated in Texas, a Secret Service agent fired for a Facebook post, students expelled. It's a long list.
A staggering list, really. But the analysis kind of mentions this morphing into a conservative version of the cancel culture, almost as an aside.
Like a footnote. When really, this immediate state-involved crackdown is one of the biggest, most controversial parts of the whole story.
Absolutely. So the suggestion is to really center that. Structure the critique around the sheer speed and mechanism of that crackdown. And the profound irony involved.
The irony being?
The irony being that the group famous for things like the professor watch list, tracking academics for their speech, suddenly leads this charge defining certain speech as hate speech and using government power, the FCC, governors, to shut it down.
It's a complete inversion, almost overnight.
It is. Now, should the analysis acknowledge the potential counterargument, that they felt under attack from a hostile media and were acting in self-defense?
Maybe briefly acknowledge it, but the core point remains the hypocrisy of the method, right? Especially the use of state power.
Exactly. Even if you grant their premise of being under attack, the immediate turn to government censorship clashes directly with their stated principles. That's the crux of it.
So concrete examples to drive this home?
Contrast how Kirk's life was being used symbolically for free speech and open debate, while simultaneously, people like VP Vance were calling for crackdowns on uncivil speech.
And the threats against broadcast licenses?
Yes, show that direct contradiction. It's not subtle. It's a fundamental break.
And bring in the legal angle?
Definitely. Cite those legal experts worrying that this just opens the door for lawmakers to define hate speech to mean anything the opposite party says. Show the immediate erosion of the norm.
So the argument becomes that this wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a constitutional flashpoint. It revealed that the commitment to free speech, for some, was maybe always conditional.
Conditional on who's doing the speaking. Yeah. That the principles were flexible when power was at stake.
Okay, so those three pillars, the political utility of the martyrdom, the ideological fissure over forgiveness versus vengeance, and the constitutional paradox of the free speech crackdown, those need to be amplified.
I think so. The raw material, the facts, are incredibly strong in this piece, but pushing the interpretation on these three fronts will give it that definitive high-level insight, moving from what happened to what it means.
Right. So, just to recap the actionable steps for the listener. First, really refocus that initial section on the political utility of the martyrdom narrative. Use those TPUSA sign-up numbers, the donations, as proof of a deliberate strategy that normalized extreme views.
Second, analyze that tension at the memorial, forgiveness versus vengeance. not just as a contrast, but as a critical ideological fissure. Explore why the movement seemed to choose political retribution over a core spiritual value in that moment.
And third, make the post-assassination crackdown a central argument. Frame it clearly as a constitutional flashpoint, highlighting the hypocrisy and the speed with which free speech principles were seemingly abandoned by their supposed champions when inconvenient.
And use all that great evidence you've already gathered, the growth stats, the list of disciplinary actions, to draw those much sharper, more definitive conclusions about power, rhetoric, and ideology in play here.
This is really strong material to work with. We definitely encourage you to rework it with these points in mind and send the revised analysis back to us here at The Critique. We're looking forward to seeing how it evolves.